All right. Okay, everybody. I'm going to get us started with our program for the evening, and then I'm going to get out of the way, and we'll hear from our speaker this evening. Tom is going to introduce our speaker, but I'll speak very briefly about CMGA. I see a few new faces in the audience, so I'll just tell a little bit about our organization. We are the psych section of CMGA. We've been around for more than 50 years, and our purpose is to support, encourage, and equip those of us in our profession of psychiatry who are seeking to live out our faith through our profession. Now, that's unique for each of us as we're in unique positions, and each of us have been gifted in unique ways, and the Lord has called us in unique ways to serve. So some of us may be in academics or in government or in private practice or serving on the mission field, and so the ways in which we've been called is going to be different for each of us. But we come together every year at this conference to talk about what that looks like for each of us and to encourage one another and to share our collective wisdom and learn from one another. So tonight, Tom Okamoto is going to introduce our speaker this evening, and I'll turn it over to you, Tom, and let you do that work.
Very happy that Kay's schedule opened up to come down here and talk to us. I think I'd like to go on and on about how she's got all kinds of things on her plate, but we're going to have fun for that. Let's get her up here. Kay and her husband Rick have founded the Saddleback Church in Lake Forest, and she's very passionately involved in advocating for people who live with mental illness, as well as passionately involved in suicide prevention. But the most important to her is being a mom and grandma. So can we support her and thank her?
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
It is an honor to be speaking with you tonight. I really appreciate the time. I am completely a fish out of water because my world is not the world of academia or medicine. It is the world of the church. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, as Tom said, about one of the deep passions and commitments of my heart and my life is that to call the faith community in particular to holistically care for people living with mental illness so that they have the hope of healing and recovery. And this is not a discussion that is clinical for me. This is a discussion that is the most personal that it can possibly be. Comes from my own, in my family, our experiences. I've lived with a low level of depression and anxiety for most of my life. I don't even really remember a time when I didn't carry the weight of the world on my little girl's shoulders. I didn't know to call it depression because that was not a word I was familiar with. Nobody I knew talked about being depressed. And even if I were to hear that, I was a Christian and a pastor's daughter, and Christians and pastors' daughters did not get whatever this depressed thing was. So I had no idea that I was living with low levels of depression. My husband has experienced panic attacks. When he writes his biography someday, autobiography, I'm sure he'll tell how he spent 20 years with every time he opened his mouth, every time he led a Bible study, every time he preached, every time he did a wedding, every time he counseled somebody, he fought panic. And he is one of the toughest people I know because so many people would have given up, would have chosen a different career, but he knew God had called him and he stayed in ministry. But for 20 years he sought healing, he went to healing lines, he tried hypnotherapy, he tried counseling, he tried medication, he confessed sin. He did just about everything he could think of that could possibly get rid of these panic attacks, and eventually one day, somebody discovered this amazing medication called Lexapro, and it changed his life. And after being on it for quite some time, the doctor said, I think you might be okay to try it without, shall we? And he gradually weaned off of it and is doing really well. So I had my own struggles. My husband lived with that anxiety and panic attacks for so many years. My older daughter and my middle son have lived with anxiety and depression. My youngest son, Matthew, was severely mentally ill for most of his life. He was diagnosed with depression at 7. But again, I didn't know children could be depressed. So he probably would have been diagnosed sooner had we understood that he was living with depression. And it went from there to ADHD, to panic attacks, to early, he was 12, early onset bipolar disorder is what he was diagnosed with, then major depressive disorder, then OCD, then suicidal ideation, and then his last diagnosis was borderline personality disorder, and that was diagnosed about 1.5 years before he took his life in April of 2013. So this is a road that I have walked. I don't know it from your chair. I know it from my chair. I'm the person who has sat in the chair opposite of you. I've been with my family members as they have sat in the chair opposite of you. And I know it intimately, I know it well. And I would tell you that in spite of the struggles and the losses in our lives, and the severity of mental health issues in my family, now I'm watching my grandchildren. Some of them are beginning to show some signs of anxiety and depression, and it's actually pretty terrifying to see this, this illness going down through our family. But our faith is strong, and we are absolutely determined to not only survive, but to thrive. And that's what we have attempted to do, particularly in the loss of my son, Matthew. Living with a person with severe mental illness takes a toll, and an almost unimaginable toll sometimes. And families need all the support they can get. And I can tell you, having lived with, a son who was very, very ill, and other children who then were ill, and then my own illness and my husband's illness, that when lay people go to the internet for help, because I'm going to, you guys, I really thought about what I was going to say, and some of the things I'm going to say tonight may be a little hard to hear, and I apologize for that in advance, but I'm going to tell you the stories that I hear, and then I'm going to tell you about some things that I think that maybe you could do differently, and some things that, how you can help in the faith community and churches. So some of the things I say may feel a little harsh, but, and if they do, then, I don't know, you can think about something else. Because I'm probably going to do it anyway. But as a lay person who knew nothing about mental illness when my son was diagnosed at 7, I didn't know where to begin. I didn't know where to start. The people I was seeing didn't really help us. We were seeing a primary care physician, and he didn't really know too much about depression or ADHD, and he thought my son should have an evaluation, but that person, I remember that psychiatrist sitting with his DSM, so it would have been in 1992, so whatever the DSM thing, whatever the number was back then, he was sitting in front of his DSM whatever number, and he never looked up at my child. He didn't look up at me. He read through his book, made a few notes, the room was quiet. My little boy, sitting in a chair, watching a grown man analyze him, but not look at him, not talk to him. And it was really the first of many, many failures that happened along the way. But you know what, lay people, we don't know what to do, so we go to the internet, and there's a plethora of information, and you don't know who to believe and who to trust, and you hit this link, and that takes you to 3,000 other links, and then you look up at the top, and it shows there were 5,676 hits for that thing you just entered, and where do you go, and how do you know what to do? And it becomes this vast morass of unintelligible information. And it would seem like there's so much information out there, but for people like me, as just an average person, there really weren't that many things to find. And probably every day, almost every day since my son died 4 years ago, I talk to grieving families. I talk to grieving loved ones, as well as individuals almost every day who live with chronic suicidality. They've made attempts on their lives, or their loved ones have already died. And I hear their stories of pain and loss. I'm not a medical professional or mental health professional, but yet just 2 weeks ago I kept a log of the people that I had talked to, either through text, email, or had come in on my Facebook and social media. And just in 1 week, I was talking to 7 surviving families who had lost a child to suicide. I talked to 3 suicidal young men, chronically suicidal young men. I talked to the mother of a murdered child whose child was killed by a young man with mental illness and who also had a gun. And I talked to 4 other parents who had lost children to other causes. That was just 1 week. And that was direct conversation, not I heard about and this, I heard about, no, these were direct conversations. But that's a pretty typical week for me. I hear the stories all the time. You hear them from one side, I hear them from the other side. And I'm going to tell you some of the things that I hear from lots of people and then fit in with some of mine. I hear over and over about a broken, and I'm putting this in parentheses, a broken system of care. Yeah. I hear people telling about a broken system of care for themselves or their loved ones. They tell stories of well-meaning mental health professionals who nevertheless appear cold, uncaring, and on occasion inept. I hear the stories from loved ones who are excluded from information and input for their mentally ill child or parent or spouse, as if they were treated as though they were the problem. Certainly not part of the solution. They are the problem. And the HIPAA laws, while well-meaning and actually good in many ways, and you could probably tell me much more than I know even about this, have only complicated mental health care for the sickest people among us. I hear stories of frustrated, desperate families looking for help for their children, for their teenagers, for their young adults, for their spouses, only to be met with an almost impenetrable and incomprehensible system of care that resembles a medieval maze more than it represents up-to-date, accessible, affordable, and a coordinated system of care. And the fact that there's not enough pediatric mental health care in this country is a travesty. In my wealthy county of Orange County, those of you not in this area, about an hour north of here, it is a very wealthy county. It's highly educated, highly affluent, 3 million people. And in that county of 3 million people, there is not one pediatric inpatient psychiatric bed. Not one. Not one. Just 2 days ago, I'm dealing with helping a family right now whose 10-year-old was attempted suicide just this weekend in Orange County, but he had to leave our county because there was no care for him. And now he's in a crummy place, not a good place in LA, where he's already been beaten up. 10-year-old little boy, he's already been beaten up. And the family's writing to me saying, what can we do? What do we do? We trusted our baby to their care, and he's already been beaten up. There are 140,000 children with mental illness in Orange County. It's enough to fill, any of you that are baseball fans, think of Angel Stadium where the Angels play, and it's enough to fill that stadium 3 times with the number of mentally ill children in my county, and only 20% of them are in care. This is wrong. I hear the stories almost every day of primary care physicians, most insufficiently trained in psychopharmacology, writing prescriptions because they can, or because there simply aren't enough trained psychiatrists and other mental health professionals, especially pediatric psychiatrists and psychologists and professionals in rural areas. I read today that you know this better than I, that 59% of the psychotropic drugs in the United States are prescribed by primary care physicians. Only 23% of them are prescribed by psychiatrists and addiction specialists. Families and individuals talk to me about sometimes the narrow approach of psychiatry in particular, knowledgeable about psychotropic drugs, which I believe in, but woefully informed about the rest of the person, physical health, spiritual health, emotional health. And I have to tell you, my bias, you may hate me, my bias, the term behavioral health, is one of the most stigma and myth-reinforcing labels I think is on the planet. Behavioral health implies that it is your behavior that is a problem, and that if you would change your behavior, you would not have a problem, and that your behavior is wrong, and that implies to many that if you just would do something different, you would be okay. I realize I'm stepping into the middle of a long-standing debate around verbiage, but my bias is that at the very least, behavioral health is an unhelpful term. If we really believe that the brain is part of the body, and that things can go very wrong in our brains, as they can in any other organ of the body, then we would seem that we might be better served by talking about brain illness rather than even mental illness, as though there is a mental illness and a physical illness rather than a more whole being approach. The body is a self-contained unit with each part necessary and vital. Does that ring any bell in your head about each part of the body being vital and necessary? The Bible seems to understand, just want to see if you're awake, the Bible seems to understand that our bodies and brains are dependent on each other and completely interconnected. Medicine and the government don't get that. And these families that I talk to talk about a lack of parity around insurance reimbursement for mental health services. Some spend thousands, hundreds of thousands of non-reimbursed and unequally reimbursed dollars to seek care and treatment and support for their loved ones. These families that I talk to on a daily basis, they talk about the cost of residential treatment, because sometimes the 72-hour hold is not even the beginning of enough to bring health, mental health, brain health to a person who is living with this illness. But you know, I know that residential treatment is out of the question for about 99.9% of those who would need it here in the United States. I know this personally because just this spring, an extended family member spent 7 weeks at a very well-known clinic. If I mentioned it to you, you would know it in a heartbeat. Spent 7 weeks at this well-known clinic at a cost of nearly $100,000. Only possible because extended family members were able to kick in that money, otherwise out of reach. The 3 barriers that I see to better mental health, very simple ones, but it's the availability of good care. First of all, it's just not available to a lot of people. Secondly, the cost of care and the lack of parity enforcement and the sneaky ways that the insurance companies look to get around enforcing parity in providing coverage. And then this one that really relates to you in this room. The competence and compassion of the mental health professional giving the care. Access to good care, the cost of good care, and the competence and compassion of the mental health professional actually giving the care. Let me speak to this for just a few moments. My son Matthew was hospitalized 6 or 7 times. I was trying to remember, and maybe I blanked because I don't even want to remember how many times he was hospitalized for either a suicide threat or an actual attempt to kill himself. And it became one of the greatest fears that he had in his life. Do not make me go back to a hospital. I will not go. And at the end of his life, he was making the threat, if I will kill myself, if you call the police to come get me, if you call the police to come get me, I will kill myself because I'm not going back to the hospital. I'm not. And we knew that a 72-hour hold at that point was pretty much a waste of time. It might hold him through those 72 hours, but all it would do was leave him more scarred, more bitter, less trusting, more committed to taking his life. So before he died, a few weeks before he died, I felt this countdown happening. I felt powerless to stop it. But I asked him to sit down with me and tell me what it was that he objected to about being hospitalized. Because to me, I had fought so hard to get him hospitalized several times. I was the one who called the police. I was the one who called a psychiatrist and said, he's deteriorating, I don't know what else to do, and was told every time, you must call the police. You must call the police. You must take him in. He's not going to go in by himself. You're going to have him committed. And so as I sat down with Matthew and I said, buddy, what is it that you hate so much about it? I realize some of the places you've been have been a bit of a hellhole, but some other places seem really nice to me. And there's some good people there, and why are you so dead set against this? And I'm going to give you his top 7 reasons for why he hated the psychiatric inpatient. Number one, at the top of his list, lack of dignity, the dehumanization. I'll probably cry through some of this, and I'm sure you'll be okay if I do. His last attempt before he actually completed suicide 10 days later, he swallowed poison, swallowed liquid nicotine. But then he started feeling sick and he got scared. It didn't kill him, but he got scared, so he called me. So as I met him at the hospital, finally talked him into going into the hospital, they made him strip and wear a hospital gown. They wouldn't even let him have his underwear. And when it was time for his meal, they brought in his meal in already cut up pieces, like he was a 2-year-old, with a plastic fork. And when he opened that cover on the tray and saw the meat already cut up and a plastic fork, he put his head down on the tray. He sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. And he said, "I am a man. No one should cut up my food for me." And the shame. He was taken finally from the ER to a mental hospital because they didn't have a unit there, by fully clothed. Remember, he's basically naked. He was taken to the psychiatric hospital by fully clothed, burly, handsome young men. Well-muscled young men who strapped him to a gurney in restraints. One of them was kind enough to cover up the restraints with a bit of a blanket so that as he was wheeled to the ER out to the waiting ambulance, most people maybe wouldn't notice that he was in restraints. But he knew it. And the stark contrast between these young men who were at the top of their game, handsome, well-bodied, in good shape, who had a job, who had a profession, who had come to get him, the young man who was so amazing but had a mental illness, and the shame and the dehumanization that occur on a daily basis for people living with mental illness is crushing. The number one reason he did not ever want to go back to the hospital was the dehumanization, the shame, and the lack of dignity. Second was the lack of flexibility. He had my mind's skipping what it's called. He needed gluten-free food. What is it called? Celiac. Thank you. Mind blanked. He had celiac disease. But could he get flexibility in the psychiatric ward? No. We have our food, and what you can have, if you have celiac disease, you can have a piece of royal chicken and plain vegetables and some fruit. That's what we have to offer you. You take somebody who's feeling suicidal and you put them in a psychiatric ward and tell them that you don't have food for them and the bed is as hard as a rock and no, you cannot have your own pillow. Are you kidding me? You may not. And you take somebody who's already just tried to kill themselves and make them as physically uncomfortable as possible and expect them to thrive. Lunacy. 3, he said the lack of privacy. In all the facilities he was in, there was only one where he had his own room, his own bathroom. 4 was the lack of safety from other patients. In one place he was in, he was beat up by a fellow patient and had to be taken for an MRI to make sure he didn't have a head injury. 5, the lack of compassionate care from mental health professionals. His suggestion, be compassionate or find another line of work. Please. Please. If you are overworked, if you are jaded, if you are busy, if you are cynical, if you're tired, if you're understaffed, you're done with listening to all the crazy, loony people that you've had to listen to for all these years, then get out. And get out now. He said the lack of lived experiences by physicians impacted their ability to get their patients. We understand how important peers are in every other facet of life. We understand the need for having somebody else with a lived experience. If you're training somebody to be a shoemaker, you want somebody who knows how to make shoes, somebody who's done it, somebody who gets it. That's who trains you. Why, if we understand that in every other area of life, that lived experience piece, why not in a mental hospital of all places? Shouldn't there be people who understand what it's like to live with mental illness? And then the seventh one, he said, it's just boring. He said, the lack of meaningful activities. He said, they give you, and I saw this in my own because I was there visiting him so many times, a few coloring books with some broken crayons, puzzles with missing pieces, tired, worn-out games that 4-year-olds play, and a piano that hasn't been in tune in 50 years. And that's supposed to be helpful to someone living with a mental illness. You're smiling because you know it, and it's so ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And so those were his. I'll give you a couple of mine. At his first hospitalization, as I stood sobbing in the ER, talking on a payphone, I don't even know where my cell phone was, talking to his current psychiatrist, and said, Matthew has just OD'd. He survived, but he's in the hospital, and I don't know what to do. I'm terrified. What do I do? His response to me was, Mrs. Warren, I'm so sorry. There's nothing I can do. I don't see people in the hospital. I'm like, what? Excuse me? You are his psychiatrist. What do you mean? What do you mean? I don't know what to do. You've been talking to him. What do you mean you're not going to help us? A pain specialist, as he got closer to the day that he died several years later, he had started seeing a pain specialist because he hurt all over. And you know that there's physical pain often with mental illness. And sometimes you can pinpoint what it is and other times you can't. But he was seeing a pain specialist and who encouraged him to be open with him about his mental health, his mental illness. And Matthew at that point was telling everybody that he was going to kill himself. It was just a matter of time. I mean, it didn't matter who you were. Matthew would tell you he was going to kill himself. It was almost like a badge of honor. And so he tells this pain specialist who encouraged him to talk to him that he was suicidal, that he wanted to die. And the doctor encouraged him to email him, gave him his email, said, email me. Please, I want to stay in touch. I want to support you. Stay in touch with me. And so Matthew, by that time, was pretty convinced that assisted suicide was the way to go and that we were all fools for ever wanting it any other way. He was pretty convinced, and that was, I don't believe that, but that's what he believed. And he sent an email to this pain specialist who had encouraged him to talk to him and be honest and be real. And he said, would you euthanize me? Would you please he begged him to put him out of his misery. Now, I realize that that's a very difficult email. I'm not unsympathetic to the physician, but the physician sent him a certified letter dropping him from his practice for non-compliance with the treatment plan. I happened to be there that day when Matthew got that certified letter, and he wept. He cried. He felt so betrayed. He didn't really expect this physician to honor his request, but for the man to drop him because he was fearful, Matthew shot him back an email saying exactly that. I feel abandoned. I feel betrayed. You told me to email you. You knew I was suicidal, and you dropped me from your practice. The man's response was to call the Orange County Sheriff. The next thing I knew, they were standing on the door ready to take him in. And it was only my ability to be there and say, listen, this is not the situation. This is just a young man who was desperate. He's suicidal all the time. Today is no different. Please, he's okay. Please just let him be. His last hospitalization after he took the poison, and it didn't kill him. I immediately called the attending physician. I figured out who he was, called him every day, begged him to call me. After Matthew was released, 72 hours later, he called, left me a message. According to Matthew, this physician, this psychiatrist, saw him for a total of 30 minutes over those 72 hours and never once talked to him about his suicide attempt. This same doctor had the moxie to call me 10 days later after Matthew's death to offer his condolences and his services. In all honesty, I struggle to forgive him to this day. I have, because I don't want my soul to get bitter. And I dread the day that I will have to meet him face to face because he's active in the Orange County mental health efforts. We've even been on conference calls together. By the way, it's not two wonderful physicians here from my city. We have been on conference calls together, and he's never acknowledged me, and I have not mentioned that I know who he is, but that day will come because I'm active in mental health care in Orange County, and he is too. And one day, this doctor, who did nothing for my son, who spent 30 minutes with him and didn't speak to him of his suicidality, and who called me, gave me his condolences after my son died 10 days later. That'll be a hard day, and I have to see him face to face. Let me just make two pleas for you. Never stop growing in your competence as a psychiatrist, please. Never stop growing. Never stop learning. Never stop learning about the latest research that will help you as you diagnose your patients, as you figure out what's the best treatment, what's the latest. Don't think, please don't ever get to that place where you think you've learned all there is to learn. Please keep learning. Please keep learning. In one of Matthew's hospitalizations at a university hospital in Southern California, that again you wouldn't know if I mentioned, and the psychiatrist had seen him for several years now. I was doing some reading because all the different diagnoses, none of it seemed to make any difference. The medication wasn't helping. His chronic, he was suicidal, he was making attempts, he was attempting to attempt. He was miserable, he was so severely ill. And I just started doing some reading on my own, like I'd done for years. And when I read about borderline personality disorder and Matthew fit 8 of the 9 criteria, I talked to his doctor and I said, do you think, I don't know, do you think that he might have borderline personality disorder amongst all the other things that are going on with him? And he said, not really. And I said, well, I was reading and Matthew does this, he thinks this has been a problem since childhood, this has been a problem, and I went down the list of what I observed in my son, and he goes, maybe. I said, how come you've never even mentioned this to me? He said, he doesn't fit the profile for borderline personality disorder. And I had just been reading, and I said, oh, what profile is that? He said, well, he's not female, and he grew up in a stable home without violence. Excuse me, I had just been doing a lot of reading, and I said, sir, I am not a professional, but I think your information is out of date, because that's not the way people think about borderline personality disorder anymore. Why did I have to diagnose my son? But it made all pieces fit. And when Matthew understood that, his response to that was, I get it, and you're probably right, and I see that, but it's too little too late. It came after he had already made the commitment to kill himself. So don't ever stop growing. Don't ever stop learning. Don't ever stop becoming even more competent in what you do. Please become more and more competent about suicide and suicide prevention. You guys, when I drove up here today and I pulled into the Embassy Suites, we are directly across the street from where just on Saturday night, Joy and I and a few of our friends walked an American Foundation for Suicide Prevention's overnight walk, the Out of the Darkness Walk for Suicide Prevention. 16 miles, my feet are still swollen, I can hobble, I can't even walk straight. And we walked this entire area. It started and ended at the park across the street from here. I didn't even know that. I had already, be honest with you, I didn't even remember I was coming here at that point. And to show up here just these few days later, I feel like I'm supposed to talk to you about suicide and suicide prevention. I just did it with 1,000 other people. And at the end of that walk, if you've ever done the walk that they do, the overnight walk with the symbolism of you walk through the darkness, because of the darkness of despair and suicidal thoughts are so, it is bleak. But you walk through the night to the dawn, to the hope of a new day, a hope of living again one more day, and the hope that is there. But as you walk through the finish line, walk is not even the word I would use. I was dragging myself. I am not an athlete. Dragging, every part of me hurt. And they have these luminarias that we were supposed to decorate with something about our loved ones. So I put a picture of my son on this little paper bag. It's now filled with sand and a candle. But there are 950 others. As I'm walking through the finish line, there were 950 luminaria. Faces of men, women, children, moms, dads, brothers, sisters, spouses, best friends. And my thought was, there are just too many. There are too many. There are too many. It is the number 10 killer in the U.S. overall. You know this. But it's the number 2 killer of people ages 10 to 34 in the United States. The number 2 killer of people between 10 and 34. And here's one of the things that's so sad to me, is that according to the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, the vast majority of mental health professionals, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, licensed counselors, and psychiatric nurses do not typically receive routine training in suicide awareness or prevention or risk management. And this lack of expertise impacts their ability to provide comprehensive care for at-risk patients, despite evidence that having a competent clinical workforce is critical to reducing the rate of suicide. Despite evidence that when a clinical workforce is trained in suicide awareness and prevention, that it in effect reduces the number of suicide. Most mental health professionals are not trained in suicide awareness or prevention. So, as I beg you to keep growing in competence about research around the latest and greatest in your field, please add suicide awareness and prevention to that. I give you 4 places immediately that you could go for more information. One of them is the Suicide Prevention and Resource Center's AMSR training, AMSR, Assessment and Management of Suicide Risk. It is a fabulous one-day course. We've offered it at our church at a conference that we've had. You should absolutely check into the AMSR training if you've not. Also, the Suicide Prevention and Clinical Workforce Guide for Training from the Action Alliance on Suicide Prevention. I'll give you these later if you want. The American Association of Suicidology has recognizing and responding to suicide risk, 3 different categories of training. If you understand that most of the people in your profession are not trained, how can we expect this growing epidemic to be any different? There's what the community can do, but it's what individuals can do. There's what families can do, but there's what you as the medical professionals can do. You play such a critical part in reducing suicide, and you need to educate yourselves on this. So don't ever stop growing in your competence, and please don't ever stop growing in your compassion. Don't stop growing in your compassion, because this is an equally egregious error by psychiatrists and other mental health professionals. An incompetent professional who is as kind as the day is long can do damage, but so can a competent professional who has the personality of an amoeba, the kindness of a rock, and the empathy of a tree. Nothing substitutes for compassion. Absolutely nothing. And there's nothing that substitutes for the shared experience, for creating an atmosphere in your practice of, I get you. I get your pain. Is there anything that we as human beings long for more than that? To feel like somebody gets us? Isn't that what each of us longs for in our relationships? Is just have somebody look you in the eye, that little flash of recognition of, I get what you're saying. I hear you. And if it's not even that, at least the empathy, the flash of compassion that says, while I may not understand, man, I care for you so deeply. There's nothing like that. I have yet to meet a person in need of a mental health professional who said, I love my doctor. He's so aloof and disengaged and detached from me. But I've met hundreds of grateful souls who say, I love my doctor. He or she really seems to care about me. My pain matters to her. My story matters to her. There's nothing like that. And that's even more important for you as Christian psychiatrists because you wear an additional label. Christ follower. You wear that label, and the Bible is explicit in its instructions to love, to be kind, to be compassionate to one another, and we are to be imitators of God and live a life of love, as Ephesians says it. Other mental health professionals might be able to get away with a more clinical approach, but you cannot. Let me close by just really quickly giving you an acrostic based on the word church. We don't do anything without an acrostic in our church. I'm sorry, it's like we can't do anything without an acrostic. So it's based on the word church, because I fully believe that there will never be enough professionals in the world to take care of all the psychiatric needs. There will never be enough medical doctors. There will never be enough social workers. There will never be enough dentists. There will never be enough, you name it. There just won't. There will never be enough healthcare professionals to take care of the needs of our world. So how can the church fill in some of those gaps? If we know already that even if we were to dramatically increase the number of psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers and psychiatric nurses and all that, even if we could dramatically increase that number, there will never be enough. So what can the church do to make a difference in the lives of people living with mental illness? And I'll give it to you later. You probably don't have a piece of paper, but using the acrostic church, the first is C. It's just simply to care for and support people living with mental illness. Most people look at our church, which is a very big church, and I get that, and they think, well, of course you have an outreach to people living with mental illness. You're a big church. You have money, you have staff, you have programs. Of course you do. But the church I go to has 50 on a good day. There's no way that we could really do anything impactful around mental illness. Oh, yes, there is. The 6 things that I'm going to give you really quickly don't cost a penny. Literally, they don't cost a penny. They do not require staff, and they don't require much training. Pretty simple stuff. How much does it cost to decide that your congregation is going to be a caring and compassionate congregation for people living with illness, mental illness? It costs nothing. It costs nothing to have a congregation that has an attitude toward people living with mental illness and their families. You are welcome here. You belong here. You fit here. You are wanted here. That costs nothing. All it costs is a decision of the will that says, we're going to care about people living with mental illness. We may not know everything there is to do, but by golly, we are going to be a place where people in this community who are living with mental illness are welcomed and wanted. Costs nothing. The first H is to help with practical needs. My friend Amy Simpson, you should have her speak to you sometime. She's an amazing gal. She's written a book called Troubled Minds. Grew up with a schizophrenic mom in ministry. Her family was in ministry. Her mom lived with schizophrenia. And Amy is just an amazing woman who cares about mental illness and the church. But she says mental illness is the no casserole disease. When I was diagnosed with breast cancer 14 years ago, and people lined up as fast as they could to bring us food, to take care of my kids, to do my grocery shopping, to clean my house, take me to my chemo appointments, take me to my radiation appointments. I mean, so many people wanted to help when I had a diagnosis of breast cancer. But if somebody in my church receives a diagnosis of bipolar disorder this week, I pretty much guarantee you that unless we work at this, there will be nobody who says, can I bring you dinner tonight? I understand you just learned that you have bipolar disorder. Can I take you to your appointment? Is there anything I can do with your kids? Can I help with? I mean, why did we change? Why did we stop? Why did we refuse to treat mental illness the way that any other illness is? We can help with practical needs. Doesn't cost money to help with people's practical needs. The U is to utilize volunteers. But I want to talk to you. You be a volunteer in your church. You have something to contribute. You have expertise. You have knowledge that other people in your church don't. So if every church needs volunteers, why not use yourself as a volunteer? At Saddleback, we have several psychiatrists and neurologists and pain specialists for some of the severely mentally ill people in our church. And they're on a consulting basis. They allow our pastoral care team to call them and ask them questions. You can be a volunteer in your church in that way. What if you decided that you were going to train the mental health professionals in resource-poor areas of our nation, like the reservations or the inner cities? What if you decided that you were going to take the expertise that you have and you were going to volunteer your time, not just to go serve, if you're a dentist, not just by pulling teeth, you're a psychiatrist, so you're not going to be pulling anything, but so you're not going to just go treat people, but you're going to train other people. who can do some things in your absence. You can train trainers. You multiply your efforts if you actually train people in resource. So you be a volunteer. Ours to remove the stigma. Again, it costs nothing. What does it cost when we stand up in front of a congregation and the pastor or you, if you're leading a Bible study or you're leading a small group, and you say, you know what, I realize that the first time Rick stood up in our church and prayed for people living with depression, he called it out and he said, God, in our midst today are some people living with the heavy load of depression. Some are struggling, they could barely get out of bed this morning. God, would you bring them comfort? Would you bring healing to them? And the people who came up to him afterwards and said, you talked about depression today. I've never heard my depression talked about at church before. Just that simple mentioning of mental illness is a stigma-busting action. That can happen in every congregation. It doesn't cost a cent. Here's another thing that you can do in this acrostic is to collaborate with the community. Because not only can you go and offer your own services within your own congregation, but you can help train volunteers, because there are some things that need a little bit of training, and you, with your knowledge and your expertise, you could offer training in your church to people who want to help others with mental illness. You could offer your services to other churches in your community. If your church isn't taking you up on it, I'm sad for your church and sad that you're a part of a church that isn't willing to. So take your services somewhere else and offer to volunteer to teach and to train other people who want to be a part of helping with mental illness. Use your voice to be an advocate for better services and parity. You know, one of the things that we do at Saddleback is we do research, and we try to find good psychiatrists, good psychologists, good mental health professionals in our area. And we have compiled a list of them so that when somebody comes into our church office with a pastoral care need, we don't sit there and go, I don't know what to do. We've got a list already of people where we can start sending people for some of the help that they need. Well, you could do the reverse. Because we're looking for you to send people to you, but you could do the reverse. You could scout out the churches, the faith communities in your city that are already doing something around mental illness, and encourage some of your clients, when it's appropriate, to actually go there, to check it out, to check out Celebrate Recovery. Celebrate Recovery is a Christian 12-step program that was started at Saddleback 25 years ago. 4 million people have gone through it. It's in 27 of the state prison systems. It's an amazing recovery program. And the people that you see, many of them also have what? An alcohol or substance use issue as well. And to actually be able to, you refer them out to where they need support. Because the deal is, no matter how compassionate you are, no matter how competent you are, you cannot be with your patient as much as they need people to be with them. Even if you give so sacrificially of your time, you know that. It's impossible. So who fills in the gaps? Their family can only fill in a certain amount of those gaps. They need a church. They need a spiritual home where there are support groups, where there are people who are welcoming, who want them, who are willing to befriend them. One of the things that when Matthew was, after he was diagnosed with borderline personality, and I asked, so is there a support group? Is there any group for him to meet with while he's here? And I was told, no, we don't get the borderlines together because they feed off of each other. And I'm like, wait a minute, he already feels like a freak? And now you're telling him he can't be with other people who struggle with the same mental illness he does because they're going to feed off of each other? Do you realize how much that just increases that sense of aloneness, of I'm different, and that there's nobody like me? Why do we do things like that? Why do we do things like that? People need support. And then you can beef up. This is one thing you could do. If you're a part of a hospital, if anything of what you do is part of a hospital, you can, this goes into that suicide training that you could do. Suicidologist David Rudd has shown that women are 246 times more likely than expected to die by suicide in the week following a psychiatric hospitalization, and that men are 102 times more likely to die in that first week, and that the risk stays high for the next 30 days following hospitalization. So if you're a part of a hospital, you could encourage them. There's something called zero suicide. I can't encourage you strongly enough. It's a whole system around what a hospital can adopt as that, meaning that no suicide, one suicide is too many to happen from a psychiatric hospitalization. And then the last H is to offer hope. Because we could talk forever about the heartbreaking statistics. You know stories that I don't know because many of you have been in practice for many, many years. And much of it is outside of our control. But as a woman of faith, all of this to me points out this very deep need for partners in healing, and new strategies of how the psychiatric community can come alongside the church, can continue to grow in expertise, can continue to grow in compassion. They used to call the early Christ followers who started hospitals, they called them the parabolani, the stretcher bearers. And you are stretcher bearers. You frequently meet people in their most desperate moments, their most desperate times, and in essence when they can't walk. And so you hold a stretcher, you're one end of a stretcher for these folks. You have an enormous responsibility to doctor well, and most of all, to love well. And I thank you so much for your time. I told you that I was going to say some things that were really on my heart, but thank you for listening. Thank you for not throwing me out on my ear. I'm happy to take any questions or entertain any suggestions, or you can tell me I'm way off base. You can do any of that, I suppose. Tell me what didn't I answer, or what question did I open up that you'd like to talk about a little further? Thank you for your smiling face, by the way.
Oh, you're welcome.
No, seriously, those of us, when you stand in front of people, some people just look at you like they're like, oh, I just wish you would shut up, I'm so tired. And other people smile at you and thank you for being a smiling face.
Well, okay. Well, I have a comment, I have a criticism, and I have a question. Okay?
Wait, I need my pen.
No,
I
you don't need to take notes.
Oh, yes, I do. This brain.
The comment is, thank you for what I think, I don't know if you've given this talk before,
I
but
haven't.
it's fabulous. So thank you. You said a lot that people need to hear. That's my comment.
Thank you.
My criticism is that you're just giving it to this micro group of Christian psychiatrists. And I think your voice needs to be heard in a bigger setting. And my question is, how many more of these do you have in? Because I think it could make a difference.
Well, I'll give you just a tiny little answer on that last one, because, I was really happy with my life before Matthew died. I mean, just it was really hard to live with a son who was so seriously mentally ill. Just often felt like we lived with an emotional terrorist where every day could be his last. It was hard. It was really hard and hard on our whole family. But I was an advocate for people with HIV and for orphans, and I traveled the world, and I loved what I did. I loved being an advocate for people with HIV and for orphans. I loved what I did. And then Matthew died. And the day he died, it became very clear to me that my life as I knew it and loved it was over. That I would, as much as I would have always cared for people living with HIV and for orphans, I had just been thrust onto another path that I did not choose or ask for or want.
Right.
But it was the path that I was on. And so it became clear to me that day, if I was going to survive my son's death, that I would shift my advocacy. And so my advocacy has shifted, and I am on this path until God shifts me in another direction, and I hope he doesn't. I wanted this to be something Matthew and I did side by side, and that is not what happened. But I really do see him, as we were doing that walk, I really did have that sense of that cloud of witnesses. I don't really understand what that cloud of witnesses.
Yeah.
I don't really quite understand the Hebrews 11 and 12, the chapter, the cloud of witnesses. Unhealthy Matthew here would have hated what I was doing. He would have fought for something very different. But healthy and whole and healed Matthew, cheering me on. And so I will do this until God tells me to do something else.
Well, I think there are certainly a number of us here that if there's any way we can help facilitate that. I would love to hear you speak this to the entire, to one of the big forums at the APA and a number of other places. And,
I would say yes, fast.
And so I'm from Ohio, and we every year have something. Hopefully I'll be able to shoot you an email.
Thank
But
you.
this
Beautiful
is
chief of staff is an Ohio girl. She's a Buckeye. Right there.
All
She had
right,
explained
there
to
you
me
go.
what
There you
Buckeyes
go.
were.
Yeah,
So. Yes.
But, you know, I think this. The other comment is, so much of this is driven by how we think about it. And I started out in pediatrics, and I was going to do pediatric oncology. It's important stuff.
It is.
I had the opportunity to give a talk back at the hospital that I sort of grew up medically in. And I was able to show them a pie chart with the top 20 causes of death in children and young adults. And I was able to show them this piece and say, that's what we learned about in the pediatric hospital. And this is what kills young people. And suicide kills more than anything in that other little thing. So thank you. God bless you.
Thank you. Very kind. Yeah.
In our small town in West Virginia, we have several churches that have celebrated recovery programs. I didn't know that it started
It did.
in your church. So
Yep.
thank you for that.
Yes.
Very effective.
It is a great program. CelebrateRecovery.org.
When I try to do what I can in our community. One time, the state, West Virginia is a small state, 1,800,000 people for the whole state. So anyway, the 9/11 telephone operators said, come and talk to us about suicide. And I did. I came and I said, the first thing I did though, I went to their protocol, 9/11, and they were asking me to teach them how to manage a call. And the instructions, if you are suicidal, call 911. So they didn't have the training for that. So it's an ongoing process.
It is. And there's no state mandated uniformity at all. Varies by state. Yes, I saw some other hand. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
No, I just was, to your knowledge, how many of the professionals that cared for your son were Christians?
Starting from when he was 7. Maybe 3, 10.
Is those 3 any way to stand out for good or not, either way?
They were nice people. They weren't particularly competent, but they were nice.
Follow up just one question.
Yeah.
This is going to sound like I'm
It's okay.
anti-biblical counseling, which I'm not. I actually have additional training. But to me, the Christian counseling movement has wedged itself between church and psychiatry interface. I don't know what to do about that, because I don't disagree with where they're coming from.
Right.
But it's like the church can take refuge, and well, the answers are all in Scripture. Well, you know what, I got saved in Scripture. I agree with it. The manifestation of that and how to apply that in a crisis phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning, it's awful hard to go to Proverbs, you know?
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions? I don't know how y'all's church works with the Christian counseling movement, however that you're going to find it pathetic or otherwise. Do you have any suggestions on how we can work within that paradigm?
Excuse me, I'm so sorry. Well, we, like so many things, we probably swim down the middle of the river because how can the Bible not be the basis for my life? It is, always will be, and nothing else will ever have what the Bible has. At the same time, I do believe God has given medicine and people, I think He's given wisdom and knowledge in psychiatry as well. And so I'm not one or the other. I very much feel like we swim down the river. So we do our best to blend both. When people talk to me now, and again, I say I am not a medical professional, but I do talk to so many people who say, what can I do? I go to my psychiatrist. I take the medication my psychiatrist says. That's, a lot of people are not compliant. But let's just say, people say that they are. But I'm still struggling. I'm still really struggling. And that's when I try to say, you are a whole person. You are a whole being. And for you to go after and attack, if you will, mental illness, you're going to have to go at it from every angle and arena you can possibly go at it. You need to start with sometimes people who are just getting started, I say, you need to start with a physical exam. You need to go to your doctor and have a physical exam. And your doctor may run some tests, and the doctor may find something that is contributing to maybe depression. And then if your doctor feels like, I can't see anything here, but, so in other words, then it's like, so get an evaluation from a psychiatrist. Physically, how are you eating? If you're living on Twinkies and Coke, your brain isn't going to work really well. It's just not. So what are you eating? How are you resting? How are you moving? So physically, what can you control as a physical being? I tell people, what is there? You probably burned some bridges emotionally. What are some relationships that need to be repaired? Spiritually, you need to be in a small group. You need to be with people who love you, who are helping you connect with God spiritually. You need to see your psychiatrist. If you need to be on medication, you need to take your medication. If you need to talk, to see in therapy and working on new ways of thinking. I mean, in other words, it's all of it. I do not believe that there is a single answer. I know none of you would say you believe one thing is going to fix a person. And so when that's sort of the way that we handle that there is a place for the Word of God and your spiritual life and your walk with Him. And Eric Johnson, we were talking about Eric Johnson from Louisville, and I would recommend, you might look up Eric's, I cannot remember the name of his, or do you know it exactly?
Soul Care or something.
Soul Care or something. Eric Johnson is a professor at Southern Seminary in Louisville. He's a prime example to me of somebody who's doing exactly what you're saying, who is integrating biblical counseling with the principles of psychiatry and medicine, and doing it, I think, in a way that does not throw either out, but is attempting. He's an excellent. Did he speak for you guys last year?
Yes.
Oh, Eric is an amazing man, and Joy's going to look it up here for the name of it.
Well, yeah, 5 U's is
That's his book, I think.
overview, but then he has a brick that
Yes.
says book on soul care and sort of a.
But his organization he's trying to bring people from all different points of view
Society for
together.
Christian Psychology is sort of accomplished.
Yeah.
Your husband's
That's
son,
the book.
the first sermon after your son's death.
Yes.
Was perhaps one of the more powerful things you've ever heard. Because your message is not just about passion and pain and loss, but he's the pastor of the church. And he was given this message. And I hope that you and he continue to speak to other pastors about the same thing. If a pastor of the church whom I love the church. But if he spoke even a half of what to our congregation, what you spoke to them today, it would go a huge distance in terms of other people mobilizing. I don't know how to get him there. I'm not sure exactly how. He's not going to listen to me because he thinks I have the best selection.
Which of course you do not. But.
I don't, because I don't have private practice. I only see people in church or else they work internationally, so I don't have a vested interest.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, he's only going to trust a man God.
Yep.
He's going to trust a man to shrink.
Yep.
So I don't know if you and your husband also have this opportunity to speak to the clergy, because powerful for them.
We try, simply because we realize that is our prime platform, is the world of the church and pastors. And trying to help pastors do better what they already do. Pastors are already, I was telling our table that I think Lifeway Research, Ed Stetzer and Matthew Stanford and some others have shown that about 20 to 23% of pastoral care calls in evangelical churches has something to do with mental illness. Somehow mental illness is part of that pastoral care call. But if pastors don't recognize that, because they weren't trained in seminary, they weren't trained in Bible college, then they don't even recognize it. And when you talk to them about mental illness, there's a thought of, oh, gosh, it's one more thing I have to do, one more issue I've got to care about. And we try to say, no, you're already doing this. So let us help you do better what you're already doing. I tell you, in October, we are hosting a conference, a 3-day retreat for pastors, or whoever's going to be in charge of a mental health ministry in a church. And we're limiting it to 50 churches to come, and with the intent over 3 days, so that they come saying, you know, we're not here as looky-loos. We are coming because we want to start or expand a mental health ministry in our church. And in that 3 days, so that they leave with a plan. So that, because we're tired of just talking about it and having people say, oh, that's really cool, and do nothing about it. So we want to intentionally train pastors.
Information on that, access
Yes.
to that would be
Yep.
available.
Yep, Joy here, we can get that to you. Because for that exact reason, we want to actually multiply that. Oh, sorry, she had her hand up a moment ago. I don't know if you still do or not.
I think that you cover a lot of it.
Okay, yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you for what you had to say to us. I found it very powerful. My pastor preached last week on suicide in Massachusetts, and I wonder if you have thoughts about the faith community becoming a source of advocacy like it did in the civil rights movement for the mentally ill.
I would love it. I would love it. It's my dream. Again, if we're going to be on the side of the disenfranchised and the marginalized and some of the least in our society, it is the mentally ill. This is exactly where we need to be. Leading the way. I sometimes say I'm going to throw a little paint. You know, the AIDS activists, they got action because they were willing to get loud and get noisy and throw some paint. And I'm not offering any commentary on that other than to say action requires people who will demand action. I mean, and I think we have to get loud and noisy and throw a little paint. So, yes.
My name's Esther. I'm actually starting Child Psychiatry Fellowship at Harvard UCLA.
Yay!
so
Yay! You my new best friend.
Probably. I'm really glad you're here. Your talk was very humbling for me. I feel personally very convicted. And I'm wondering if you have specific suggestions on how, what we can do to appear competent and inspire confidence in our patients.
Pediatric or pediatric? You know, I think kids are like horses. I think just as a horse can supposedly sense someone who's afraid or doesn't want to be there, I think that children can sense when the adults around them either don't feel confident or don't know what they're doing or don't really want to be there. And so I think it has to start from that just most genuine place within you, and that best part of you that is driven to help children can't ever go away. It has to stay, that fire has to stay burning really brightly. Because, and again, there are just some great places. There's Clarity Children's Guidance Center in San Antonio, or the it's a freestanding child inpatient hospital that is amazing. You need to check it out. Clarity, not Charity, sorry, it's Clarity Child Guidance Center in San Antonio. Visited it a couple times. It's an amazing place. And they are pioneering work with children. The problem is there just aren't many good models, I don't think. When I mentioned that in Orange County, we don't have a single pediatric inpatient psychiatric bed for someone under 12. But because of some of these conversations, the Children's Hospital is building now, the first in Orange County, and they'll open next March. And they are seeking, when we started working on it, it was like, where's a model? Who's doing this well? Who in the United States is a model for child psychiatry for the whole child? And there were a few places, but not nearly as many as you would think. So please check us out. Please come to Orange County. Please check out Clarity. Please talk to me afterwards. All those good things. Yeah.
Can you speak a little about the organization spearheaded the Hope for Mental Health and how
Yes,
we might be able to take that back to our all
Yep.
town areas and plant that in our church.
Yes, just on Friday, he asked me to speak about an event that we just hosted on Friday. It was called Hope for Mental Health, two different things. I'm going to talk about both of them. Hope for Mental Health is our website, Hope and the number 4, and we have tried to populate it with some of the top people, both secular and believers. We have Patrick Kennedy talking about parity and talking about, there is no health without mental health, and on eating disorders. We had the past president of the APA, Paul Summergrad. So I mean, we have people that you would know well, and other people. Eric Johnson was one of them at Stanford, Amy Simpson, some of those folks. And that's our effort to help churches get equipped, in a simple way. Because we realize, as I said, for lay people to jump into these topics on the internet is a bit of a overwhelming task, because you don't know where to go. So we're trying to take trusted sources like from SAMHSA, and NIMH, and CDC, and WHO, and APA, all the people that are respected who have information that we can then pass on in terms that lay people can understand, to equip churches, to equip lay people, to equip parents. And so that's on our website, hopeformentalhealth.com. This past Friday, we held the first event that I've never heard of it before. We called it Hope Rising, and it was a day just for people living with mental illness. And it was hosted by people living with mental illness. Those who sang were people who were self-disclosed, living with mental illness. We seated people around tables, and for that whole day, they had their table leader was somebody who was living with mental illness. And the point of it was to make, soon after Matthew died, very soon after Matthew died, I had a vision in prayer. I can't say that I have visions in prayer very often in my life, but I had a vision in prayer. And in that vision in prayer, I saw our worship center filled with people living with mental illness, and that everybody was there. There was crying, there was laughter, there were people, they were not having to look at each other going, okay, so I wonder, do you think he does? Do you think she does? It was, no, everybody in the room was there because they were living with mental illness. We had some big crosses with blankets and pillows. It was an experiential day. So in my prayer vision, there were people who were feeling so alienated from God because of their mental illness, or they were angry, or they were struggling. And some of them had taken blankets and wrapped themselves around the cross, a symbolic way of clinging to their faith or begging God for a reconnection. I mean, it was, like I said, very experiential. We had art and music and guided prayer experiences, and the opportunity for them that whole day to just not have to pretend, to not have to make anybody think anything different. They could just, and I watched the barriers fall through that entire day. I watched how they started in the morning, a little fearful. We've never done this before. Staff members, people on staff, leading groups, so they were saying, I'm living with a mental illness. So we had staff saying, I live with a mental illness, and I love Jesus, and please sit down at my table and let me share what my life is like. Can you share with me what your life is like? And I watched those barriers and those big old giant bricks of stigma start to fall, so that at the end of the day, when we did a kind of a grieving and hope ceremony, a place of where people could acknowledge what they've lost to mental illness, and what their hopes are for themselves, and how Jesus is that water of life, that source of life that gives us the ability to grow and heal and change. And people hugging and weeping, and people already sending me emails saying, this changed my life. This needs to happen around the world. This needs to happen in every city on the face of the earth, where people living with mental illness do not have to be ashamed, that fear of being different, of being freak, of being unlike anybody else is dispelled. They're just in a room where they are allowed, they can talk, they can share, they can receive hope, they can grieve, they can be angry, they can fall apart if they need to, but it's such a safe place. That was what I thought you were asking me about. That was on Friday. And I can't wait to reproduce that somewhere else, because it is, it was a powerful experience. 400 people, 300 people in that room. We limited it to 300. Most of our conferences could be thousands. We limited it to 300 people so that we could get personal care. The church counselors and prayer counselors. It was fantastic.
And we can take the resources from your website.
Yes, you can use
those.
use those, absolutely. The videos, there's videos that you can play if your church doesn't have anybody who's willing to stand up and say that they're living with a mental illness. It was the same with HIV. We didn't have anybody willing to say that they were HIV positive, but we played videos, and suddenly people would go, oh, you look like me. You look just like me. You're HIV positive, same thing. What, you have an eating disorder or you have schizophrenia? Oh my goodness, you look like me. So yeah, all that stuff is available. Free, use it, take it. Yes, sir.
So thank you for a very powerful testimony. So 2 days ago, was it 2 or 3 days ago, we had a journalist speak at our conference. Her name is Susanna,
Vargas?
yeah. Susanna what?
Vargas, was it?
No, that's Elizabeth. Yeah, Callahan.
Thank you, Joy.
Her book is Brain on Fire.
Yes.
And do you know about her?
I am about halfway, I've halfway read it.
Good. So my point is, I think you have just as powerful a testimony as she does. She was talking about her experience with doctors, different, mistaken diagnoses and things like that. And people were really listening carefully. And I think you have a right to challenge us and, be tough on us the way you were tonight. And, just like the group, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, you got to speak out and make your points. Now, one thing I want to say, not to justify or rationalize what happened, just to give you a little background, I've had, since my training, I've worked at 3 different hospitals in Chicago. Some hospitals are good, especially the pediatric, the child and adolescent. Some are bad.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of what we call defensive medicine going on in the psych, in the inpatient units. We've had actual cases where patients have picked up knives and stabbed people and killed. And then the staff gets sued, the hospital gets sued. And so people are very paranoid, they don't want to give you anything. Actually, one of my patients tried to hang himself in a hit, but survived. But then the question becomes, what was available to them? Did you put this away? Did you put that away?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't have dignity. You're right, you should fight for that. But I want you to know there are some hospitals that are just not good.
Yes.
They don't have the resources, they don't have the proper milieu therapy, and by you speaking out, hopefully things will change. Just there are some doctors who are bad apples, and they don't represent the entire profession.
Some bad pastors out there.
Right. But one last comment is last year we went to a conference, my friend Manoj was there. There was a guy who attempted suicide by jumping off the San Francisco Bridge. And he came, and he survived.
Kevin Hunt.
Kevin Hunt.
Yeah.
Again,
It's amazing
the
story.
point is, he was also talking about experience with his doctors. And that was powerful. We need to hear from you and patients so we can change. We're not perfect,
Yeah.
but thank you for coming.
Thank you for those comments.
Well, I'm Manoj, by the way, so it was, the talk was very, I was listening to it very intently. I'm from state of Pennsylvania and working mostly in corrections right now for several years. And it's a tough environment. We see a lot of mental health now in corrections, especially in Pennsylvania. Almost 81 state hospitals closed down. There are only 9 left out of 90. The community care, I think somebody mentioned, you mentioned that it's very fragmented. It's very inadequate. Many programs closed down. Counties don't want to fund them. It comes down to the state level.
Right.
And now the state budget is constrained. I mean, actually, we have just 2 prisons which closed down, state prisons. We do see a lot of crisis. The correction setting is very, very ripe with severe personality disorders, antisocial, borderline, and in very serious mental illness as well. Luckily, there are several levels of care that is happening in the correction system. We have about, I think, statistics for about 11 completed suicides in the last 10 years. It's about the same population-wise. I mean, given the condensation of mental, because I think current data is about one third of the population has some significant mental health condition, right? And given that the suicide rate has been, I mean, obviously goals are to bring it down further as much as possible. attempted suicides are probably far more. Attempted gestures are far more, not always necessarily of suicidal attempt, but a lot of times some sign of distress, and we try and attend to them in as sort of a team way. We have a lot of officers and correction officers. They need a lot of education on mental health. We see a lot of diversity of that. But that's another very big system.
Yes.
While there's a lot that needs to be done in the community, that system has become very, very significant part of mental health care. So I just want to address that doing more outreach to that. We do have to take some very tough measures at the time for people in crisis, and our intention is not to punish them or I say that to my clients all the time that we have to take these tough measures. I did not punish you, and this is what we have to do. And many times they do understand. And that's like we can argue both ways on that, but sometimes somebody is really in a crisis
Right.
and
I do understand. I understand. I do. I've been there. I understand the dilemma. I understand the dilemma. I just want to make sure that that doesn't can become hardening to those who have to give that kind of care.
But you have a very good point to emphasize that you always have to be compassionate, and that compassion comes with your own growth as well,
Yes.
spiritually, and that makes a difference. Even you're being tough at the time, but they do see that compassion is there.
Absolutely. Thank you for your time. I've got other things I can show you once we.
Yeah, go ahead, if you want to introduce,
well,
show us.
All right, quickly, because I know
Yeah.
you've been
No,
sitting a
you're
long
fine.
time.
No.
Okay. We have a toolkit. Some of you were asking that for your churches. We have a toolkit. It's our 1.0 version, so it's going to get better and better and better, but we figured, if we wait for perfect conditions, we'll never get it done. So we did a 1.0 version of a toolkit for a church that wants to start a mental health ministry. And in that toolkit, Joy was so good to point this out to me, there are testimonies, there are messages, there's messages from Rick to pastors, there's some of the sermons that he and I and another pastor have preached at Saddleback. We have what's called our Anchored Weekend. We did a student version of mental health. We did a mental health weekend for our students called Anchored. It was amazing, and the number of kids who shared their lives and their story was incredible. We did, this is called A Journey Toward Hope. This is something that some of us who have lived with mental illness put together for people living with mental illness. It's not a journal, it's more of an experiential thing, but sometimes you just don't know what to hand to somebody who's living with mental illness. Maybe a standard journal or curriculum or whatever is of limited value. This is written by and for people living with mental illness, of connecting them spiritually and giving them hope, Journey Toward Hope. That's in there. And then this is, we call the Mental Health Resource Guide, again, because lay people don't know where to go. If a congregant comes up and says, I was just diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, most pastors are going to go, what did you just say? And don't even know where to go to even find an answer. So we very carefully sourced all those places that I was mentioning to you, mentalhealth.gov, Mental Health America, NAMI, SAMHSA, NIMH, every place you can think of, AA, CAP, AFSP, ANAD, CDC, DNSFI, Mental Health Guide, How We Love, Mayo Clinic, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, an explanation of what many of the basic mental illnesses are. What's the difference between mental illness and mental health? What are some signs if my child is starting to, so that a staff member, like at our church, somebody goes, okay, I don't know a thing about it, but I've got this little guide right here, and they pull it out, and it's been reviewed. It's not been peer reviewed, but it's been reviewed. And it's really it is a simple guide. It's also downloadable as a PDF for lay people to have a simple access of about basic mental illness. So it's for pastors, it's for people who are not professionals. This is all in that toolkit for Hope for Mental Health toolkit.
Available how and where?
It is on our website, hopeformentalhealth.com. I think it's $69, $79? Yeah, it's not super expensive. It's not like some of the things that cost $800. Pardon me?
Cheaper than Scott.
We're trying. So anyway, I'll have some of those if you want to look at those. And thank you, you've been a great audience, so attentive. So kind.